Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
On a very, very rare day when I'm not quite sure what we should do together today. Clearly, the conversation will revolve around events in the House of Commons last night and quite possibly this morning as well. But the febrile atmosphere plumbed new depths yesterday. I won't be, I'm afraid, falling into the trap of talking about both sides for the same reason that I didn't fall into the trap of talking about both sides when Donald Trump attempted to use that sort of rhetoric to effectively defend neo-Nazis who left a woman dead. So what else can we do? The British media has become so built upon the notion of battle lines being drawn and sides being picked and brickbats and, well, not bouquets, being lobbed at each other. I don't know that we're fit for purpose this morning. I really don't.
He may have been forced back to Parliament by the courts, but this evening Boris Johnson did not look like a Prime Minister chastised by the judges. He was unrepentant, unapologetic and combative, almost daring the opposition to try to bring him down by agreeing to a general election. Mr Johnson wasn't the only one using blunt language. Opposition MPs who had fought for Parliament to get back to work returned to exchanging insults over Brexit. But when one Labour MP called on the Prime Minister to tone down his language, invoking the memory of Jo Cox, her murdered parliamentary colleague, Mr Johnson described her remarks as humbug. There was uproar and disdain on the Labour benches.
Well, here in Westminster, shocked MPs have spent today conducting a post-mortem into how last night's Commons debate descended into such rancour and anger. Many MPs, including some Conservatives, have blamed Boris Johnson for using divisive language. There was fury when he said the concerns of female MPs about their safety was humbug. This evening, the Prime Minister has said he deplores threats to MPs, but he insisted that he should be able to describe the law which will force him to ask for an extension to Brexit if he can't get a deal as the Surrender Act. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is here. Well, here we are talking about the Surrender Act. Is that what he wants?
I think it is. There's just been a political cabinet this afternoon at which I think there was an attempt to make sure ministers held their nerve as bits of the strategy looked like they were falling off, and they had a presentation on polling and the election, and they were told that this phrase, Surrender Act, is really cutting through to voters and works with a great chunk of voters when they hear it. And they're saying that that's the reason why the opposition are trying to gag them. The opposition, of course, say that's not why they're trying to drop phrases like that. It's because the warlike language blurs with other, more extreme warlike language, and that helps to support even more anger out there and violence. But the Tories have a problem with people in their own backyard on this. One cabinet minister told me he felt sick to his stomach last night when he was listening to the Prime Minister's rhetoric. And one Tory MP who's a lawyer told me he was worried for his professional reputation being connected with the party right now. The other development that has been running on today is this question about whether the government will implement the law which Parliament passed, which makes sure that, or tries to make sure, that Boris Johnson has no option. If he hasn't got a deal, he's got to have a Brexit extension. Senior government sources I've been speaking to say they really are pretty confident that they've found a loophole in that bill. And the fact that it just requires the Prime Minister to do a certain thing on a certain day, write that letter on a certain day, doesn't preclude doing things on other days, which might negate it. And into this whole discussion tonight, Sir John Major, the former Prime Minister, has waded in. He's about to give a speech talking about how he thinks there is all sorts of chicanery afoot over trying to avoid what that Act of Parliament was trying to get Boris Johnson to do. And for good measure, he's said that he thinks the current strategy is reckless and divisive. And that's all without what's been going on in there on the second day of the Parliament that was recalled by the Supreme Court, where today they were pretty much focused on yesterday in Parliament.
It's a disgrace!
He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
An MP concerned about death threats mocked by the Prime Minister. All part of an evening in the Commons last night when things seemed to turn darker. The anger was frothing and the provocation, for some, intolerable.
The Prime Minister says tempers need to calm down in Parliament after the torrid scenes in the Commons last night. Boris Johnson says he totally deplores any threats to anybody, particularly female MPs, but has refused to apologise for his use of language. Several MPs said they had been on the receiving end of death threats, partially blaming Mr Johnson's speeches on Brexit for fuelling extremist behaviour. The Speaker, John Bercow, described the culture as toxic and said it was the worst atmosphere he had ever witnessed in the House. This report from our political editor Laura Kuenssberg contains some very strong language.
We will not betray the people who sent us here.
Subject to death threats and abuse every single day.
I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
This is the language. A publicist, this is it.
Politics has never been for faint hearts.
This man is an idiot. We won't tolerate this. Sorry.
But there was poison in the air last night.
That is respectable, whatever your views are.
Was your language in the comments yesterday appropriate?
Frustrated by a lack of Brexit progress, the Prime Minister is happy to provoke. But there's fury from Labour MPs at that kind of talk. An encounter between a Labour MP and the Prime Minister's advisor, Dominic Cummings, in Parliament was filmed by a member of the MP's team.
About death threats overnight, should be dead. It's a disgrace.
The MP, Carl Turner, said he'd had death threats last night. Mr Cummings' answer, get Brexit done.
Don't tell me to get Brexit done.
In the Commons itself, a sense of disbelief for a moment the morning after the night before.
Yesterday, the House did itself no credit.
Still rage, though, from a friend of the murdered MP, Joe Cox.
When I hear of my friend's murder and the way that it has made me and my colleagues feel, and feel scared, described as humbug, I actually don't feel anger towards the Prime Minister. I feel pity for those of you who still have to toe his line.
Just think about what we witnessed last night. Joe Cox was murdered by a white supremacist terrorist. You know that for me that was an incredibly significant moment in British political history, but also in my personal political development, because I just presumed that that would change everything. It was a crime that occurred. It was a murder, an assassination, a terrorist attack that unfolded mere hours after that disgusting Breaking Point poster was unveiled. And it seemed to me to be a very, very, very clear delineation of where we would go if we fell for the rhetoric, the toxic, vile rhetoric of the Breaking Point poster. I can never separate the two in my mind. I'm not suggesting that you should completely copy my perspective on this. I'm just being honest with you about my perspective. I can never separate the two. And that is, of course, part of the reason why her name was raised in the House of Commons yesterday. I can't quite believe that I need to explain this, but apparently I do, because prominent people, some of whom I presume are acting in good faith, some of whom clearly aren't, but prominent people profess not to understand what I now need to explain. And if prominent people don't understand it, then unprominent people probably don't either. And I'm going to choose my words a little bit more carefully than perhaps I usually do, and I shall tell you why. Because when you receive death threats, or indeed threats against your family, you have little choice but to shrug them off. The alternative would be to go quite mad. And although it is almost always quite easy to shrug them off, the temptation occasionally to talk about them or to reveal them to a broader audience is diluted enormously by the suspicion, possibly even the knowledge, that the sort of pathetic inadequates that send these sort of missives would sit there getting aroused and excited by the knowledge that you had received it. Okay? So there's two reasons there why you don't generally take them very seriously. The assassination of Joe Cox reminds us all, whatever your perspectives or politics may be, it reminds us all that sometimes these threats are not issued frivolously or designed solely to scare the recipient. Sometimes they are signposts towards serious, imminent crimes. In the case of Joe Cox, a murder. And the words that appear on these missives, these messages, do often echo the words that are heard on the broader stage. When Paula Sherriff called upon the British Prime Minister yesterday to stop using the sort of words that routinely appear on the sort of death threats and vitriolic abuse that people like her receive, she could not have conceived of the response that she would get. And nor, I think, could you. Even if you are, to coin a phrase, the most ardent Brexiter in Britain, right up until that point, if I told you that a British Prime Minister would behave in such a depraved manner, you would not have believed me. But this is where we are today. The minute he did, you felt compelled to defend him. You wouldn't have done that 5 years ago. You'd have been just as disgusted as everybody else is. You'd have been just as disgusted as morality and decency demand. But Brexit has broken everything so completely that today, having fallen 4 years ago for some harmless guff about British fish, blue passports and sovereignty, today, that path has led you to a place where you are defending a Prime Minister who insulted the grieving friends of a murdered MP in a parliament that he shut down unlawfully. I'm going to say that bit again. You have found yourself somehow defending a Prime Minister who maligned the memory of a murdered MP, insulted her friends, and all in a parliament he was found this very week to have shut down unlawfully. A Prime Minister who, I would add to that, for those of you who genuinely care about such things, whose regard or respect for Parliament is probably best expressed not by the fact that he closed it unlawfully, because that verdict could have gone the other way. 11-0 is a fairly convincing result, but it could have been different. So you don't even have to look to that for evidence of how Boris Johnson feels about our sovereign parliament. You just look at the fact that he hired immediately after becoming Prime Minister as his most senior aide, a man who had been judged to be in contempt of that parliament. And it's almost impossible to unravel for those of us who didn't fall for the guff about British fish and sovereignty and blue passports. It's almost impossible to unravel because no political cause is so acute or so urgent or so important that you can shut your eyes and sit on your hands while one of your leaders behaves like Boris Johnson did last night. Now, nobody who listens to this programme is going to be in the slightest bit surprised by what we have learned about Boris Johnson since he became Prime Minister, because we have been aware of his failings as a man and as a politician for many, many years on this programme. And we have the zeal of the converted. I make no bones about the fact that I voted for him to be London Mayor, because I'd kind of fallen for that buffoonish, clownish exterior. But what we've learnt about him since he became Prime Minister, even if it is a mere confirmation of what we already suspected, it's now posing a very real threat to the British way of life. This is why so many MPs who historically sit on the same side of politics, even on the same benches of the House of Commons, are almost dumbfounded with disgust this morning. I don't know if you've heard Sir Nicholas Soames speaking today, but the scenes in Parliament yesterday would turn the hair white of observers who've spent decades watching these things. And here's the thing that scares me most. What scares me most is that it might be deliberate. I don't know. I have no way of knowing. I don't pretend to know. But I do know that if Boris Johnson had not disgraced himself in Parliament last night, then today we would be talking again about his humiliation in the Supreme Court. We'd probably be talking about the fact that the company set up by a young woman who gave him technology lessons appears to be gathering momentum, we'd probably be talking about the absolute absence of any evidence whatsoever that his alleged negotiations with the European Union have been anything but so much hot air. We would probably be discussing Jacob Rees-Mogg's apparent misleading of Her Majesty the Queen. There are all manner of things we would be discussing. But we're not, and nor can we, because what Boris Johnson did last night was so unprecedentedly egregious. And I don't, historically, as you know, have much affection for entirely opinion-based conversations. I do prefer, unfashionable though it may be, to float a few facts before we start drawing our arrows and taking pot shots at each other. But today I just kind of want to know what you think about this fear I have, others have, that it might be deliberate. And how did you end up moving from a perfectly feasible acceptance of claims that turned out to be false regarding sovereignty or control or borders or fish or even passports? How on earth do you think you ended up getting groomed in such a fashion that you could move from impassioned defences of democracy, albeit flawed intellectually, they were still impassioned, to somehow cheering a man who shut down Parliament unlawfully, maligned the memory of a murdered member of that Parliament, insulted grieving friends of that murdered MP, and presides over a government whose most senior lawyer stood up in the House of Commons yesterday and insulted the whole of Parliament. Brexit was sold to the people of this country as a necessary step in the restoration of parliamentary sovereignty and British judicial power. What we have seen this week is people still cheering for what they call Brexit, now reduced to cheering attacks upon parliamentary sovereignty and attacks upon British judicial power. And what Geoffrey Cox did yesterday was exacerbate those attacks from the front bench of the government's seats. I don't think I'm prone to hyperbole. There are mornings where I really want to, if it was one of those entertainments in a fairground, I really want to swing my mallet and ring that bell some mornings, but I don't. I leave the whatever it is that flies up to hit the bell, the clanger we will call it. I leave the clanger, 80% up the pole or 50% up the pole, because, Godwin's law lies that way. You can't call everyone who disagrees with you a Nazi, and some of the language that is bandied about previously feels inappropriate in the context of where we are now. It was fine 6 months ago. But when the Prime Minister is maligning the memory of a murdered MP and your friends and neighbours and colleagues are going along with it, now is the time for a serious rethink. But what happens next, I do not know. Because, and it breaks my heart to tell you this, I could click upon my inbox now and find not only people cheering the remembered murder of Joe Cox, but cheering Boris Johnson for, I can't think of the verb to describe what he did to her memory last night. The only question I have for you today: is it deliberate? The slightly lazy comparisons of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, knitted together by the alleged influence of Steve Bannon. Really, all they do is stoke up hatred and distract from politics, because when everything is a crisis, as Maggie Haberman of the New York Times has many times opined in the context of Donald Trump, when everything is a crisis, nothing is a crisis. Is this the plan? And, of course, underpinning the question of whether or not this could possibly be deliberate, and I worry that it is, of course, is the even more profound fear that it might work. Adopting a political policy that sees a Prime Minister shut down Parliament unlawfully and sully the memory of a murdered MP might work in Britain, or perhaps more accurately, in Brexit Britain. How did we come to this? 0345 60 60973. Graham's in Dewsbury. Graham, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First thing I'd like to say is I've listened to your show for a couple of years, and this is the first time I've felt inclined to pick up the phone. I'm extremely angry with our Prime Minister. His words yesterday, the question of whether it's deliberate, I'm in no doubt that this affectation that he has of being some kind of lovable buffoon is entirely constructed to serve his purpose, and it's working for him.
Well, he was no lovable buffoon last night, so I appreciate he puts on that character like the rest of us put on trousers, but do you think that the depths that he plumbed last night were deliberate? Because the defence would be, and I saw, I think it was Nicky Morgan trying to adopt this position on social media, the defence would be that in the heat of the moment, in the crucible of the Commons, in the... You know, he'd been on an overnight flight, and if he had the chance to reflect and repent, he wouldn't say those actual words or adopt that actual position again. I don't know that his buffoonish history lends much weight to the conclusion that what he did last night was considered and deliberate, does it?
I think that defence, to use his words, might be humbug. Wow. I believe that the look on his face after Paula Sherriff's most impassioned speech in Parliament, and I've been, as her constituent, I've followed her for 4 years now in Parliament. I've never seen her so exercised, and for him he had a smirk and that familiar kind of glint in his eye as he described it as humbug. And we know that in parliamentary language that amounts to something much more of a serious criticism than the word humbug normally would carry. It's tantamount to calling her a liar. And the suggestion I have seen in social media forums in Dewsbury, in Paula's constituency, from his supporters, is that she deserves what's coming her way, and I know for a fact, because she's told me face to face, she's had to ramp up her security in her own home, with the police installing panic alarms and the like, because of death threats she's received. And for my money, she's one of the best parliamentarians there is. And yet she's being tarnished with this brush of being supposedly a traitor to her country by the people who should know better, the very people who should defend her right to act in Parliament as she sees fit as our representative. I think it's disgusting, to be honest.
Obviously today I'm hoping to be talked down from my worst fears, but I mean... your words echo my darkest thoughts, and you sometimes have to look at how people are seeking to defend what you and I are pretty close to considering indefensible, and that gives you perhaps an insight into whether we're right to think it's indefensible. I found that Nicky Morgan tweet, and you're right. The word he used was humbug, and what she said in an attempt to sort of reverse engineer the exchange is this: I know the PM is aware of and sympathetic about the threats far too many of us have received, because I shared with him recently the threats I am getting. So, a private meeting, Nicky Morgan presumably shows him threats. Nicky Morgan is perceived as a Remainer, and she's also perceived as someone who's abandoned the Remain cause by taking a post in Boris Johnson's cabinet. So she may be getting grief from all corners. And she's trying to say he might have said humbug in the House of Commons, but he was nice to me when I showed him my death threat, so please ignore what he said in the House of Commons, or am I doing her a disservice?
I would say which of those responses is more important? That he says in private behind closed doors, or that he says for the world to see? I got to know Paula. I'll just tell you very briefly. I actually got to know her in the weeks following Joe's death. My kids are at school in Batley, and my family are all from, my wife's family are from Batley. And my kids actually met Joe the week she was killed. So I had to explain to my kids what they asked me. Why would someone want to kill Joe?
What did you say?
I didn't know what to say. My son was 6 when this happened, and he just referred to her as Joe because that's what she'd said to call him. I got to know Paula in the weeks after, and she was so traumatised and so moved by it that for anyone to suggest suggest she might use Joe's memory now as a calculated political move is disgraceful. And for the Prime Minister to somehow foster that environment, especially given what Nicky Morgan has said, makes him absolutely deplorable in my eyes. And I don't think he's fit to govern. I think he's proven that time and time again. And yet, what happens is his most ardent supporters now, or people who know what he's like but actually think he's serving their purpose with Brexit, retreat to their trenches, dig in deep, and say things like we've seen. If the best way to honour Joe Cox's memory is to get Brexit done, I'm not having any of that. That's disgusting. And it's just a really depressing state of affairs. Joe's family have worked tirelessly in the last 3 years to try and bring communities together. But actually on the ground in Batley, at times, you might think that the community is more divided than it was 3 years ago. Despite all of the work they've done and all of the events they've put on and all of the initiatives that are underway, actually at grassroots, when you discuss Brexit, it's a turgid, horrible place to be.
Of course it is, because once again you have people who are still enslaved by unkeepable promises, venting their fury at those who pointed out that the promises were unkeepable, instead of venting their fury at the people who made the promises. And I've given up trying to work out how to do that. I'll just keep turning up with my bat every morning and heading for the crease. Graham, thank you. I'll be haunted slightly by that question of how I would have explained to my children if they'd met Jo Cox in the week that she was assassinated. Why would somebody do that? And the answer, sadly, is pretty straightforward, because this man hated foreigners. And he saw Jo Cox as someone who reached out and had open arms for people regardless of their creed or colour, and he despised that because he felt that creed and colour should be the defining characteristics, and therefore he murdered her. Just a few hours after that Breaking Point poster was unveiled. But if you pick the wrong side then, you're probably not going to change your mind now. John's in Dorset. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'm answering the question you came up with earlier of how did we get to this, and actually taking it back a long way. I went to a rival public school, I won't name names, and I remember when I was 15 or 16 going to a swimming match against Eton. And the normal process for this is you arrive in a coach, and the captain of the team is there at the gates waiting to direct you to the pool, show you to the changing room. We had none of that. We arrived. We had to drive around the grounds of the school asking people where we were supposed to go. So we arrived a bit late, to chants of "Why are we waiting?" from all the Eton boys.
Yes.
When it came to starting my particular race, got up on the starting blocks, and there was a delay whilst our rival competitors went around informing us we were going to lose.
That does happen at sort of Sunday League football matches on Hackney Marshes as well. So I don't know that if you're heading towards a claim that this is somehow indicative of Etonian attitudes, I'm actually going to challenge you.
Okay, but
Rory Stewart was at Eton at the same time as Boris Johnson.
True, but the way I see it, one of the reasons why we hold these sporting events is to learn to.
Yeah, but that was one day, and it certainly wasn't. I mean, it wasn't the experience of my friends who played against Eton, or indeed my friends that went to Eton. And I went to a public school, which I'm happy to name. I went to Ampleforth, which is widely regarded as the sort of Catholic equivalent of Eton. And there's nothing that we learnt there that would explain how Boris Johnson found himself insulting Jo Cox's friends on the floor of the House of Commons last night. No, I hear you, and God knows how I've ended up being a defender of the public school traditions, but here I am. #waves. I just don't think that's fair. I think you would feel appalled if somebody that you went to school with did something abysmal, and it was then claimed on the radio that everybody who went to that school subscribes to that sort of attitude or that sort of school of thought. I hope you don't feel unfairly treated there, John. I really do. I keep trying to make a list of all the things that I should remind you of at the beginning of every segment of the programme at the moment, but it's too long. If I reminded you at the beginning of every segment of the programme about what Boris Johnson has done since becoming Prime Minister, 60-odd days ago? I wouldn't have time for anything else. I mean, it is genuinely incredible. There's the obvious stuff, like played 6, lost 6, when it comes to trying to get legislation through the House of Commons. Then there's the more recent stuff, like the finding of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom that his closure of Parliament was unlawful, a finding that means he stands accused, I think he stands accused and convicted of misleading the Queen, misleading Parliament, and of course misleading the people. Misleading the people is less of a shock because, of course, he did that when he elected to support the Brexit referendum, and he subscribed to an absolute farrago of fibs, embellishments and exaggerations covering everything from Turkey's mooted accession to the Union right down to the ludicrous lie on the side of the bus. But last night was a new low, and I think it was deliberate because I can't think of an alternative. No one does that by accident. I just can't think of an alternative. So Occam's razor, which suggests that the simplest solution or the simplest answer to any given question is usually the correct one, I think would lead us to conclude that Boris Johnson did it on purpose. He has decided that electoral success lies in wooing people who would have looked at Joe Cox's murder and not felt revulsion and disgust. People who would have looked at the Breaking Point poster unveiled hours before Joe Cox's assassination and not felt revulsion and disgust. And what he's doing is very similar to what Donald Trump did and still does. He's taking people with him who know that it's disgusting, but they believe, just as many previously respectable Republicans believe, they believe that he offers them the best chance of hanging on to power and, perhaps more pertinently, hanging on to their own jobs in Parliament. That's why it's happening. Here, James Cleverly today trying to argue that he didn't say betrayal, he said betray. You find yourself doing that, James. You're a decent fella. I've had the pleasure of meeting you a couple of times. You know what you're doing now. You know what you're doing. Boris Johnson is defecating over everything you hold dear, and he's sending you out to clean it up. And you're going along with it, just like people like Kellyanne Conway at the White House or Sean Spicer or various Republicans who do know better are going along still with Trump because, well, it turns out that being a depraved liar doesn't alienate the electorate in the way that most of us have spent the post-war period presuming that it must. And there it is. What are you going to do next, Boris? Yeah, well, if someone mentions death threats and fear and cites the precedent of Joe Cox as a reminder that these death threats are sometimes followed through, then I will describe it as humbug. Or I will describe the claim that the death threats this lady has received contain words that I sometimes use, like traitor or betrayal or surrender. Again, I mean, if it's not deliberate, what is it? And if you are screaming at the radio or cross with me, give me a ring, tell me how they did this to you. How did you go from believing some relatively harmless guff about British fish, sovereignty and passports, to today when you've been offered a choice between people who find the murder of MPs and the maligning of their memories repugnant and people who don't? How did they do this to you? I've been talking to you every day for 3.5 years. I've asked you 1,000,000 times what it is that makes this Brexit you desire so irresistible, and I haven't had in 3.5 years one cogent answer, apart from the racist answer, of course. And that's valid. It's real, at least. Why do you want to leave the European Union? Because I think it will mean fewer foreigners in my town. Okay, I get my head around that. It's comprehensible. It's even substantive. But apart from that answer, you've been here listening. What have we heard? Nothing. So how can something so hollow, so empty, and so false have corrupted you to such a degree that today you're describing being exhilarated by the sight of Boris Johnson laughing, essentially, or mocking women concerned about their own safety and the safety of their families? And if you don't have a look at some of the reports today on Jo Swinson reporting a threat against her child to the police. Just find a report. Don't do it through the lens of my social media, because that might be skewed. Just find a report of that and look at the replies. I don't know how many of them are real. I don't know how many of them are trolls or bots or whatever the correct phrase is, sock puppets. But that's the rhetoric that's out there. And you're either for it or against it. And if you are against it, you cannot be for Boris Johnson, whether you are a Secretary of State or the Secretary of a fishing club. You just can't, not logically. But if Brexit has taught us anything since June of 2016, it is that logic is not the lever that we once thought it was. 10:41 is the time. Ian is in Marylebone. Ian, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller, so please be kind.
Of course I will.
I think, basically, the problem we've got is it's easier to believe the lie and go along with Boris's rhetoric than it is to actually admit the scary truth. From personal experience, when the referendum came round, I was on the fence, if I'm honest.
Yes.
And I come from a Labour voting family. Father was a shop steward at Vauxhall years ago.
Yeah.
As time's moved on, as I've grown up, I've become slightly more conservative in that sense. But when the referendum came around, I actually did think if we can get a better deal, a better situation than we're currently in, it's worth giving it a go.
But of course it would be.
Now, alongside that, I'm married to an Irish lady, and I think anyone will admit the benefits and the actual workings of the EU are understood a lot better by people outside of the UK.
Yes.
I'm 43. I've had, call it 30 years of newspapers telling me that the bananas are too bendy or something or other, and Brussels is enforcing this, Brussels is enforcing that. So I do think, going back to your first point, I think the media has an awful lot of questions to be answered in terms of how we as a population think of things.
Yeah, but the media can't even ask the questions because we already know the answers. They're not going to turn around and destroy their own business model by saying, not only did we lie to you for 30 years, but our lies created an environment in which we could do untold damage to the country and persuade you to vote against your own obvious interests. That's just not going to happen.
And one of the other sort of turning points, if you like, that happened with me was a friend of mine he was banging on about the 1% for a long time, and he was doing my head in. I thought, what are you on about with this 1%? Oh, they control everything. So what? No, they can't. They can't. And the more you look into things, and fact-based arguments can be had rather than emotional, it scared the life out of me, James. I realised at that point, I'm not talking like an epiphany, but I realised at that point that it is so easy to manipulate an audience that you fall in line without even knowing you're falling in line. Like,
and is it
the bendy bananas were too much for me.
Yeah, but no one really. I mean, it's more than a bendy banana, isn't it? And
it's 30 or 40 years of
but what? Chipping away, but also not just the funny stuff, not just the, we used to laugh. Probably we didn't laugh loud enough at people saying they wanted to leave the European Union because of hairdryers or hoovers.
Yeah, your 3-pin plugs, etc.
But the fear of this undefined enemy that wishes us harm. I increasingly think that was the real problem that we missed, is that even people who were, because I was like you, I was relatively ambivalent. I'd never met a passionate supporter of the European Union who was from these islands in my life. I've met a few since, but they weren't prior to 2016. They certainly weren't on the public stage.
And now we're all political experts.
Well, yeah, we're either experts or at least we know more than we did before. But the people who know more than we did before and went the other way, the effort now that's been put into keeping those eyes shut and those ears blocked is unbelievable, and that's where you get shocked.
I wouldn't go as far as to say my heart bleeds for these people, but
mine does.
I don't know.
I'm getting gypped for that now, because that line of mine about compassion for the contempt for the con men, compassion for the conned. A lot of people are suggesting that's not helpful anymore, because there has to come a point where the conned become part of the con. The alternative is to turn around and say, oh, crikey, we got this wrong. And on a day where the alternative to not saying, oh, crikey, we got this wrong, is nodding along with the Prime Minister, insulting the memory of a murdered MP, that's the day that people like Ian and me and many of you realise that probably things have already gone too far. And that's why I float the very uncomfortable question of whether or not this is deliberate. We haven't got another theory yet. We haven't really got another theory. Alan in Russian writes, I'm interested to hear from Boris supporters just what he would have to do to lose them. I'm really curious. You know the answer to that, Alan. He could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose a single vote. I'm also a bit haunted by Ian Dale at the moment because he said something on television yesterday. Ian is currently a bit like repeats of Friends. Somewhere in the world, Ian is always on television, whatever the time of day may be. But Ian, very creditably and admirably, described any attempts to malign the ruling of the Supreme Court as wrong. You can't start doing that. Once you start questioning the rule of law, everything starts to crumble. But the nature of Brexit tribalism means that many Brexiters, not all, were joining in attacks upon the Supreme Court and its unanimous decision and framing it as if it was somehow a leave versus remain battle rather than a simple question of legal precedent. But Ian had to say that, as a Brexiter, of course, if you don't listen to his programme. And the fact that he had to say it and got widely praised for it is staggering, isn't it? Here is someone, a decent man, an honourable man. I described him as a Conservative the other day, and he got cross with me because he's not a Conservative anymore, but he was a former Conservative Party candidate. A decent, honourable man whose politics are of the right, I think it's fair to say, if we're still using words like that, receiving bouquets and plaudits for stating the obvious. That's how mad it has become. And he deserved the bouquets and the plaudits, do not get me wrong. Sometimes, you know, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. 10:51 is the time. Anne is in Milton Keynes. Is this all part of a plan, Anne?
Hello. It's very much deliberate, and I can join with you in saying very clearly, I haven't phoned ever before, but my heart genuinely and deeply bleeds for the conned, because this is all about attack is the best form of defence. But I, having worked in PR, I was in the top 5 in the country for PR at the sharp end of it, and I do know something of how it works. And I think that the message of Boris, Trump and Farage, they keep it very simple so that everyone can understand, so that they can get the masses on their side. They use very simple, clear messages, very simple imagery like Hulk and so on. And it's all about pitting us against them, about choosing out instead of inclusiveness. It's about building walls instead of bridges. And we've got to remember that our European partners are our closest trading partners. We will have to work with them and have deals with them. We cannot just write them off. There's no such thing as a clean Brexit. The only Brexit that we'll have will not be as good as the one we've got. But if you look back to the way Boris dealt with the big red bus, there was no mistake in that. The big red bus. Why red? Because red is actually the colour of our public services. You think of our things that we take pride in. You could include in that, if you're that way inclined, and I don't want to influence anybody anyway, because I care about truly the underdogs in society and everyone, and fairness for everyone, for those that work, for those that cannot work for genuine reasons, like the disabled people and so on. I'm saying, look at that big red bus. That was the start of this mess. You think of our red pillar boxes.
Okay, so no, I get that. I understand the power of the imagery, and I mean it's also red for danger, and it draws attention. But where do you derive your confidence that this is deliberate? That last night in particular was deliberate.
Well, the whole thing is because he's positioning himself as he is for the people and against the establishment. He's even. I mean, he says that he respects the judgment and so on, but he says it was a wrong judgment. So he's
against the establishment, but he bought his house with money earned from the owners of the Ritz Hotel.
Exactly. So the thing we know that Corbyn, for example, is absolutely right when he says Boris is a perfect example of the establishment, if you want to look at it that way. I don't want to get into that side of politics.
No, well, I mean, Corbyn is
really
a lifelong MP. He's part of the establishment as well. But just briefly then, where you derive the confidence. So when Paula Sheriff said to him last night, and again, I can't believe I need to explain this, but like you, I'd like to give people the benefit of the doubt, and therefore I will presume that people genuinely don't understand this, rather than that they do understand but are pretending not to score cheap points. Jo Cox was mentioned in the House of Commons last night by an MP seeking to remind the House that the threats they receive sometimes end in the most unimaginably awful way. It was a necessary and important addition to the revelation that the threats exist, because we all need to be reminded. I'm in receipt of this kind of thing quite regularly, and we all need to be reminded occasionally when we tell the head of security to chill out and everything's fine. We all need to be reminded that every now and then one of them actually means it. That's the only reason she was mentioned. So for people to say, well, he didn't bring it up, he didn't bring up Jo Cox, like you, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and hope that now they understand actually why and what happened. But when he responded to that reminder, the starkest of reminders about the risks that politicians and public figures face, he chose to say humbug.
Yes. Well, we all know, some of us more than others. I speak as someone who's been mugged, and I know how terrifying that is. I speak as someone who's got a scar on the retina of my left eye. It happened during my working hours, not when I was in PR, but when I was actually at the top of my job. A colleague saw fit to laser beam me through my left eye. So I know what it's like to be on the side of right, as Jo was, and to be, attacked in that horrendous way. I mean, it just proves that we need to treat each other the way we would like to be treated.
Well, do unto others, but of course the problem with that is, well, historically the problem with that, everyone's wrestled with this question from the ancients right through to Immanuel Kant. The problem with that is, of course, that you can end up doing unto others as you would have done unto yourself, but they don't. I don't know what the answer to that is, and nor do the philosophers. And thank you. 10:57 is the time. Mark is in Wareham, in Dorset.
Yes, I could weep for the whole of this conversation, but I won't waste the time. But I just wanted to quote from William Black, Psychopathic Cultures and Toxic Empires. If we create societies where greed, mendacity, shallowness, cruelty and aggression are rewarded, we shouldn't be surprised if our culture becomes more psychopathic, and for the population of callous, destructive people to increase. And
well, and then you add to that the old line about all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. But I know that this will upset some people who like to think of me as being on their team, possibly even their mascot. But I don't think Johnson is those things. I mean, he's clearly mendacious, and there's a degree of moral depravity that is displayed in some of his personal decisions and personal life, although I'm sure he would reject that. It's important to remind ourselves of that. But I just think he's the mother of all opportunists, and he has little or no moral compass. But if he thought that electoral success would be achieved by being a sort of Mother Teresa tribute act, he'd be doing that now.
Yeah, but as you said, he's an opportunist. But I think it's inevitable where we're coming to. I feel that it's greater than the sum of individuals. I feel there's a sort of something palpable in the air, which is very disturbing.
There is, and what the answer to it is we do not know, because and the last caller and most of the callers today, like me, feel for the massive majority of people on this other side compassion and warmth and support. We think you've made a terrible mistake, and we think we've got the evidence and the facts to prove it, and we think that if we keep calmly pointing out the evidence and the facts, then you will finally turn your ire upon the people who've misled you, rather than the people who keep pointing out successfully that you've been misled. But however calmly and compassionately you do it, of course, the cheerleaders on that other side will be claiming things that aren't true. They'll be saying they all think you're a racist, or they all think you're stupid, or they all think you're thick. And as long as you've got these offers, these dishonest offers from dishonest brokers, it's very, very hard to see how normal service can be resumed. And when a dishonest broker is in number 10 Downing Street, aided and abetted by another dishonest broker who ran the Vote Leave campaign, then, well, I don't know what anyone else can do to sort of shine the light into the darkness. Jess Phillips shared one of the threats that routinely arrive in her office last night, or at least 2 lines of it. It was rather prophetic that Boris Johnson should say, "I would rather be found dead in a ditch. That is what will happen to those who do not deliver Brexit." And yet when Paula Sheriff pointed out to the Prime Minister last night in the Parliament that he shut down unlawfully, that some of the threats, some of the toxicity directed at our MPs, echoes the language used by him, the Prime Minister, he, of course, dismissed it as humbug. Is it deliberate? Because if it is deliberate, then it doesn't actually matter what you and me think, or what the Labour Party does, or the SNP, or the Liberal Democrats, or the Greens. If it's deliberate, then all that matters is whether or not, quotes, decent, end quotes, Tories go along with it or not. So you would probably expect Ian Duncan Smith to be out this morning shilling for Johnson. I wouldn't have expected James Cleverly to be. He's chairman of the Conservative Party, of course, but he could still say no, not today, sorry, you'll have to find someone else to go out and defend this. Cleverly's made his choice. Some reports of motions of censure potentially popping up in Parliament today, which will be fascinating because Lewis Goodall over at Sky News, for my money, one of the best in the business, one of the absolute best in the business, and a future superstar of this industry. He talks of Conservative MPs, utter disgust from this is just heard from a well-placed MP that there is talk of a motion of censure against the Prime Minister. Utter disgust from many Tories too. He had very few with him on his benches by the end. So is it a plan? And if it's a plan, it's an electoral plan, and it's a plan designed to draw all the votes of people who still think that they want Brexit but cannot tell you why. And there are a lot of them, as we know better than almost anyone. Absolutely adamant that I want it, cannot tell you why. You know, it was quite diverting at the time. We took a call from a lovely bloke on Monday, Gary, taxi driver, Shepherd's Bush. Something wrong with my memory. I can remember all that stuff, but I can't remember the code for our own burglar alarm. Anyway, we took a call from Gary, a taxi driver in Shepherd's Bush, and the call ended with me saying to Gary, so what you're saying is that you'll forgive Boris Johnson anything at all because you think he's the man to deliver the Brexit that you can't explain why you want it. And he went, exactly, James. And it's funny, but it's also kind of frustrating. 11:06 is the time. Give me a ring. We're just chatting. And we, at the moment, will do Mystery Hour, OK? 03456060973 is the number you will need. Apologies if you're trying to get through. I should take more calls and then free up a few more phone lines. Peter is in Estepona. There used to be a very good go-kart track in Estepona, Peter. I don't know.
There's no go-kart track here.
It must have shut down. The kids find other diversions these days. I am going back to about 1983, so it would be unlikely to still have survived. It's all flats now. Anyway, why did you ring in? What would you like to say?
Well, I'm lying on the beach here, and last night I was looking at that guy, Boris Johnson. A pathetic man. How pathetic. Not even an apology for being a liar. Number two, no respect for Joe's family.
You certainly felt that way.
What about our kids? He has no kids. He doesn't know what it's like to be a father, or does he?
Well, he's got quite a few children. There's a little bit of confusion over precisely how many. But what I'd like to draw your attention to specifically is the suspicion or the theory that this is actually deliberate, that this is designed to cement the support of the parts of the country that are still absolutely adamant that they want Brexit. They have no idea now why they want it, because they've ended up being opposed to the power of a sovereign parliament, opposed to British judges in British courts, opposed to British sovereignty. They've got no idea why they want it, but they're absolutely adamant that they do, and Boris Johnson is their boy.
Correct, and it's like going to a football match and you hear the fans shouting, even when their fans are wrong, they'll still agree with their football team. He's just jumping on the bandwagon for anybody that will keep him in power.
So I like the football analogy. So when I talk about the decent Conservatives who now have to decide where their morals lie, it's a bit like having a player on your team who's a terrible, terrible... It's a bit like Argentina. Should the Argentinian team in that mythical semi-final, should they all have said, actually, no, we don't want that goal because Maradona cheated, or are we going to take the cheat and take the win?
Right, it's like the same way as going to Chelsea, which I go to a lot. Yes. I'm not a racist, but and I'm not going to condone what some of them do. But what I'm trying to get at, he jumps on the bus to 350 million? Really?
Well, again, these are all indications, these are all signposts that some of us heeded and some of us possibly got a little bit too carried away in criticising and condemning, but some people even then were comfortable with being lied to. Peter, I don't want to keep you from your beach for any longer. I want you to top up that tan. 9 minutes after 11 is the time. Stephen is in Hastings. Stephen, what would you like to say?
I'm not actually in Hastings. I'm at Ham House at the moment working there.
I can't talk to you then. I've got to fulfil my Hastings quota by 11:15 this morning. Go on then. Just this once in Ham House. Carry on.
Thanks for taking my call as well.
Welcome.
Your question is it deliberate?
Yeah.
I don't know even that the slight on Joe Cox's family was deliberate or premeditated. But the strategy that he's using...
It can't have been premeditated because he wouldn't have known that Paula Sheriff would raise the memory of Joe.
He didn't go in saying, I'm going to insult someone who's been killed. But the strategy is definitely deliberate. So we've now got...
The strategy is to blow things up, right? To just completely subvert normality, because when everything is a crisis, nothing is a crisis.
But more than that, they've elevated arrogance to like a superpower. So they've got this unassailable arrogance. So you've got Trump can say, when they correct Trump, he'll say, well, I know more about climate change than the scientists.
Yes.
I know more about the military than the generals. And Boris Johnson say, well, I know more about the law than 11 Supreme Court justices.
Yes.
And you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg, slouching around on the...
Do you think, just out of interest, do you think that was deliberate?
Yes. I think...
I don't know that I'm going to come with you on that one, because I was intrigued by it at the time. I thought it might have been deliberate, and then they'll come out with a claim that he had lumbago or sciatica or something like that, but he just tried to style it out. Obviously, he's got bigger problems now.
They haven't justified it in any way, have they? Haven't justified it in any way.
No, Stephen and I are referring, for anyone confused, to Jacob Rees-Mogg treating the front bench of the House of Commons like a sort of chaise longue at a Roman orgy.
Yeah. But when he was pulled up on it, he just grinned. I think what I'm trying to say is that the strategy they're using is that because they're using arrogance as a sort of armour, if you back down on any point, then that's like a chink in that armour. So you have to keep your arrogance completely fortified and unassailable. So if someone mentions Joe Cox, you can't say, oh, that's regrettable and, I should moderate my language. You have to go on the attack. If someone says 11 Supreme Court justices found what you did to be unlawful, you can't say, oh, OK, I'm going to rethink, like a normal person would. You have to say, you have to go on attack. No, they're wrong. So the strategy almost boxes him into these ridiculous statements that a normal human being would never be able to justify to ourselves or to anyone else. And his own strategy has sort of boxed him in because he's gone into Parliament with the idea, I cannot agree or listen to anyone else's opinion. I cannot show any chink in my armour of arrogance.
Because if you show one, you show all.
Yeah, that's it. The whole armour will start to collapse because you make a breach in that defence and then the armour will just start to fall to pieces. And
never explain, never apologise. I can't remember whether it was John Wayne who said this or someone else wrote it. Never explain, never apologise. It's a sign of weakness.
Yeah, and
we live in a world with no explanations and no remorse.
Yes, well, they've got the benefit too. If they just go on the attack, then they've got the benefit because they've got Murdoch on their side. Then the following day in the Sun, they'll find a way of spinning that into some strength. So people are saying, well.
In the English Sun, the Scottish Sun, of course, will be punting a completely different perspective on the same reality.
Whatever they're going to do to try and sell papers.
Yes.
But, so already this morning, people are saying that it was some sort of a lefty trap to mention Joe Cox. Or
are they? Lord, I thought my social media was toxic.
I know. I've seen. I don't know. I speak
a lefty
to people
trap.
I speak to people that are sort of. I just think should know better. People are just saying you know, he's just a strong leader. Boris Johnson's just a strong leader. And
Are they
if
really?
you had to
I
deal
heard
with him-
one caller on Nick, but I mean, she sounded a little bit unhinged, I think, when talking about finding it exhilarating and exciting, and women are hysterical. Say again?
I think because I work in the building trade,
yes,
I come across
more of it. And if you said to one of your pals, and there are plenty of people in the building trade on my side of the argument, because they often tell me.
I should say I'm not trying to stereotype.
No, I know you're not. I'm guarding you against that fear. Although a fella came to one of my last shows and told me he'd actually got into a fight on a building site over wanting to have me on the radio. So there's people in both camps, isn't there? Yes,
Yeah,
but when you say to them, all right, you know, I get the stuff about sovereignty and fish and passports, and none of that's turned out to be true. Why are you still sticking up for this guy? What do you think they would say?
Well, because they'll just say, well, he's a strong leader and he has to get done what needs to be done. Otherwise, we're going to go round and round in circles.
And they say, what needs to be done? And they say Brexit, and you say why? And they say because it needs to be done.
Someone said to me, he actually said, I'm really excited for Brexit. I'm really excited to leave. And I said, why?
Yeah.
What is it? Well, I think you've obviously used this argument many times. What is the one
What
thing?
are you looking forward to?
What law is it you want to be able to break? And no one can answer.
Or just something to look forward to, apart from the possibility that there'll be fewer foreigners on your building site or in your town or on your high street, and some of those Polski skleps selling sausages and spirits can go back to being empty. They can board them up again. That's what you want, apparently. That's what you might get. Some breaking news for you. The former French President Jacques Chirac has died at the age of 86, according to a statement just released by his son-in-law. That's the former French President Jacques Chirac has passed away at 86 years of age, we've just learned. We continue to just question whether or not this is deliberate. Boris Johnson is deliberately fomenting further division and entrenchment. I can't yet see anyone who's quibbling with that. I mean, the people who are loving it aren't ringing me. They'll text and tweet, obviously, from behind their avatars of pit bull terriers and photographs or depictions of Richard the Lionheart. But they won't ring in, but they're loving it. And they think it's deliberate, and they're loving it. And then, of course, people who are worried by seeing the grieving friends of murdered MPs humiliated and insulted by the Prime Minister in a Parliament that he unlawfully closed down. Those of us who have respect for the rule of law and parliamentary sovereignty and Supreme Court judges, you know, unfashionable things like that, we mostly think it's deliberate as well. The only question left is whether or not it will work, and nobody knows the answer to that. You look over the Atlantic, you see fairly compelling evidence that it can work. But here, things are a little bit different. 20 minutes after 11. One thing that is identical, and I think this is true, it all depends on what so-called respectable Conservative MPs do. Do they go along with stuff they know to be... You see, I think Nicky Morgan is a beautiful case in point on this one. She knows that what Boris Johnson did yesterday was disgusting, so she's trying to concoct an alternative reality on social media where she is insisting that he fully understands the nature of these threats that he described as humbug, the suggestion that the language often echoes language that he himself employs. Jess Phillips has published 2 lines from a letter in which Johnson's line about being dead in a ditch if he doesn't deliver Brexit is used as a threat to what will happen to those who somehow frustrate this Brexit that people passionately want but can't describe. Weird. But that is it, I think, now. That is what we watch today. We watch, and you get a pale reflection of parliamentary arithmetic in the media, although very few of us in the media are lucky enough to be able to speak our minds every day. I mean, certainly in print media, there are lines that must be towed and jobs that must be done. We're very, very, very privileged at LBC. So the question becomes which Tory MPs still in the party, because you have to remember he's already purged 21 of them. He's already seen his own brother walk away in, we have to presume, disgust. How many of those who remain will do what they know to be right? So you can send out your Ian Duncan Smith to pretend that he believes heckling and catcalling from the back benches is somehow equivalent to a Prime Minister speaking at the dispatch box. But But Ian Duncan Smith knows that's not true. He said, well, people were shouting fascist, people were shouting... It's a bit like claiming that members of the crowd at a football match should be held to account in the same way as people on the pitch. You know, an MP at the dispatch box is judged by a very different set of rules to an MP 3 rows back from the action hurling abuse at everybody on the other side, and that applies equally to every party. Ian Duncan Smith knows that, but as with a lot of Brexiters, the next stage is, of course, to say things that you know aren't true in the confidence that people are so embedded in their tribalism that they'll cheer you and applaud you and pretend that they believe you anyway. Absolutely absurd. I heard him on another radio station this morning claiming that is somehow equivalent. Well, of course, you know, Labour MPs were calling Boris Johnson names. That's comparable to a Prime Minister at the dispatch box in a Parliament that he closed unlawfully, describing a female MP's fears that the death threats, her evidence-based fears that death threats she received often echo the language that the Prime Minister employs. And he describes it as humbug. And something's happened in the last 4 years that's seen lovely, decent, kind people persuaded that fish and passports and sovereignty were somehow major issues in their lives, turning those people into people who will now not condemn that MP. And if you're working with people like that, or if you've got people like that in your family, or you've got friends like that, the last caller in Ham House clearly does, then you can't be surprised that there's people in Parliament like that as well. People in the Conservative Party who started off with, it turned out, flawed understandings that led them to conclusions about things like sovereignty and control and British courts and British judges. It's all blown up now. It's all gone. It's fallen apart. There's nothing left. This is the elephant in the room, really. So much of the media is enslaved to balance and false equivalence. There's nothing left. What is it you're looking forward to? Well, this is where I thought we'd be now. I thought I'd spend 6 months, the second 6 months of 2016, making a long list of things that I didn't really understand, hadn't known about, which would have just calmed me right down, and I'd gone, all right, well, we better crack on with it because there's been a vote. 3.5 years later, there is nothing left except the word Brexit. It's a completely empty vessel. It was always an empty vessel into which we all poured whatever we wanted to be true. But now there's nothing left. Reality is about to bite. And there's nothing left to cheer or sell or support except the arithmetic of the plebiscite in 2016. So there's Conservative MPs who are presumably waking up every morning and spending a couple of minutes strapping on their game face. Because they're sitting there thinking, well, crikey, I was wrong about sovereignty, I was wrong about judges, I was wrong about courts, I was wrong about laws, I was wrong about freedom of movement. I didn't really understand what we could and couldn't do. I was wrong about everything. Well, I can't admit that. I'll never be able to show my face at the Reform Club again. So they have to strap it on and then go out into battle. And they're the ones that Johnson is counting on. He's counting on them doing what Republicans have done in America, and that is to put their moral compasses in a locked box, sacrifice their own heartfelt principles. It's not felt quite as deeply as perhaps they thought they were, but sacrificing their own heartfelt principles upon the altar of personal advancement. In this case, the belief that he can win an election. And make no mistake, he can. Seriously. James is in Blackburn. James, what would you like to say?
I'd just like to say that I don't think that the language used by either side is offensive or wrong in any way. In case it's actually mild compared to the conversations that the public are having up and down the country.
Yes,
I work for the NHS, and the conversations that we have on the wards are far more heated and language used in those compared to what's used in the House of Commons.
Do many of you get death threats?
Yeah, we've had a few.
For your political views?
Not to my political views, but I've had a few death threats.
Not for your political views?
No, with my disagreements with many people.
And when you share news of these death threats with your colleagues, they call you names, do they?
Well, I've been called a few names because of my political views by colleagues.
That's not what I asked. When you tell your colleagues that you've been receiving death threats, they laugh at you, do they?
Yeah, there's quite a few on the left that have laughed. Yeah.
See, you're lying to yourself now, James.
Well, I'm not lying to myself. You can't tell me I'm lying when it's actually happening.
I can. You work at the NHS, you get death threats, and your colleagues laugh at you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you need to take that straight to HR, pal.
HR won't do anything about
How do you
like
know?
that. Because I've worked in the NHS
send me the paperwork and I'll do it for you. We'll get the press office. We'll get the press office on the case. Send me the death threats and then give me the names of the colleagues that laughed at you, and we'll look into it on your behalf, my friend. Because that's unacceptable behaviour.
What's not acceptable is the blocking of Brexit.
Send it first class, James. Yeah, and I'll refund the cost of a stamp. When can I expect it?
I won't be doing that.
I know you won't, pal. 28 minutes after 11 is the time. Mark's in Manchester. Mark, what would you like to say?
How are you doing, James?
All good. What's on your mind? Just keep an eye on the post, will you? Make sure to see if anything arrives. Carry on.
I mean, that guy there was just delusional.
But that's what they're reduced to now.
I know that. So they make up lies to perpetrate a myth that doesn't exist. And
of course, part of that lie is, they're just as bad as we are.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that nonsense is just unbelievable. The language used by Boris Johnson, not so much the language, but how he used Joe Cox's name is just beyond the pale. I'm a Glaswegian, and trying not to swear is very difficult.
Little bit of casual stereotyping, but you did it to yourself, so we'll let that pass.
It was beyond the pale, and I look at this man now as the most dangerous man in British politics since Edward Mosley. James, there was when Mosley was released from prison in 1947. The Home Secretary of the day, Mr Reid, was asked by Mr Wyatt, the Labour MP for Birmingham South, would he look to enact laws that stopped the denouncement of Parliament and, I can't remember the exact wording, but the functions of Parliament. And we've now had Johnson and the Attorney General calling Parliament into question. Where are we going as a country? What is going on? All sense of everything. I mean,
but this is it, isn't it? Is you make the list of things, and what Brexit does is render this almost surreal. What matters? Parliamentary sovereignty. What matters? The rule of law. What matters? The separation of powers. What matters? Parliamentary scrutiny of the executive. All of these things, we were told by so-called Brexiters, are really, really important, and we've lost them, so we need to vote to leave the European Union to get them back. Turns out we hadn't lost them at all, and they're now being undermined and threatened by the Brexit leaders. But the Brexit followers have somehow tied themselves in such a knot that they end up doing what the last fella did, live on national radio. But I still feel more compassion for them than contempt. And for the third time, with no complaints from me, I will explain, because I refuse to believe that people are all willfully misunderstanding. Some people are genuinely misunderstanding why Paula Sheriff chose to mention the memory of her dead friend Joe Cox last night in the House of Commons. It was because those of us who receive these sort of threats, these sort of communications, in some cases on a terrifyingly regular basis, if you are female and of colour, it is always immeasurably worse than it is for a straight, white, middle-aged bloke like me, but I get my share. And you laugh them off, and you dismiss them. But occasionally we all need to be reminded that the language, the rhetoric, the ramping up of toxicity can very occasionally have the most unthinkable and tragic event. So when Paula Sheriff asked Boris Johnson to moderate his language, because some of that language is echoed in the vile communications that she and many other parliamentarians receive, I don't believe she thought at the time, and I've watched the footage twice, I don't think she thought she was doing anything vaguely controversial. She was impassioned, but I think that she was fairly confident that once this was pointed out to him, and the very powerful and profound example of Joe Cox's memory was again brought to his attention, when he was reminded of where it can very, very occasionally lead, he would immediately review his conduct. We can chat with Paula herself in just a moment. Before that, let's remind ourselves of what happened last night.
Mr. Speaker, I genuinely do not seek to stifle robust debate But this evening, the Prime Minister has continually used pejorative language to describe an act of Parliament passed by this House. And I'm sure that you would agree, Mr Speaker, that we should not resort to using offensive, dangerous or inflammatory language for legislation that we do not like. And we stand here, Mr Speaker, under the shield of our departed friends, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor. And I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first. Absolutely. So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
Now, imagine that you hadn't been across this story. Imagine you'd been watching Doc Martin last night, which started a new series. You hadn't been following events in Parliament. I even now, after all this madness and division and toxicity, even now, you'd probably expect any Prime Minister, when presented with such passion and concern for the personal safety of parliamentarians, any Prime Minister in living memory, even the one that you despise the most, would have responded with a modicum of humility and remorse. And then there's Boris Johnson.
I think, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. Because,
Paula Sheriff, good morning.
Good morning, James.
Tell me how you felt when you heard that response. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but you must have been pretty close to pinching yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've just articulated in the narrative there really well exactly what I was feeling last night. I was angry after he said that, but I was also, I couldn't quite believe it. This was our Prime Minister, and a female MP had just described how death threats and abuse were happening, not just to me. This wasn't all about Paula Sheriff. I was speaking on behalf of a large number of MPs, and indeed cross-party MPs. And his response was to say, humbug, the leader of our country. That is how serious he takes the daily threats that are coming to MPs. And we heard last night from Jo Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. She received a threat to her child yesterday. This is where we are as a country. And for our Prime Minister to act in that way, it's beneath contempt, James.
The alternative would have been for him to pledge to stop using words like betrayal or sabotage, surrender in the context of the surrender bill. I haven't personally heard him, I don't think I've heard him use the word traitor, but as a sort of hair-splitting exercise, the alternative would have been for him to pledge to stop using this language. And it occurred to me, as I sort of absorbed the impact of what happened to you last night, that if he stopped using that language, he'd have very, very, very little left.
True. Absolutely, and let's be clear, the language he is using is entirely deliberate. There is no accident. This is all part of his strategy. I expected him, perhaps foolishly, perhaps naively last night, to adopt a more conciliatory approach, perhaps a more nuanced attitude where, he would talk about how the fact that, it was clear that the country had to come back together and, as MPs, it was important that we all treated each other with respect. And I acknowledge that this isn't just a Conservative thing, it's something that all MPs need to reflect and introspect on our behaviour and our language. This isn't just about Boris Johnson, but for him, like I say, our Prime Minister to respond in such a way just demonstrates once more that he is absolutely unfit to hold the great office of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
And of course, Jo's murderer did refer to her as a collaborator and a traitor in court. Did you know, I couldn't work this one out watching it, did you know when you stood up that you were going to invoke her memory?
No. I actually hadn't intended to speak in yesterday's debate. I went in, obviously I was interested to hear what the Prime Minister had to say in response to the outcome at the Supreme Court, and we were sitting there. I was amongst, obviously, other Labour MPs, and it was clear as the statement went on that the language that the Prime Minister was using, he referred to the surrender bill, I think, 15 times, talked about capitulation, betrayal, and his general demeanour and his use of language was really inflammatory. And as that was happening, I was looking on social media and you could see that people were getting really wound up and they were repeating that language and they were taking it one step further, and it was clearly whipping up a storm. And I just felt I felt like I had to do it, James. I felt a duty and a responsibility to get up there and say that, and I hadn't. Even when I stood up, I'd approached Mr. Speaker and said, I want to do a point of order about the Prime Minister's language. He said, well, you can't do it during the statement. I said, right, in that case, can I shoehorn it into a question? He says, yes, that would be in order. So when he called me to speak, I hadn't intended on going on, being quite so emotional or speaking for such a long time. But it came from the heart. It really did. People are scared, James. I'm speaking to MPs from all parties, and indeed, this morning, a number, and I'm referring to more than 10 Conservative MPs have come up to me and they have said they are mortified at the Prime Minister's behaviour yesterday.
This is where echoes of Donald Trump...
Including a Cabinet Minister.
Really?
Yes.
Gosh. Well, will they do that publicly then, becomes the urgent question, doesn't it?
I don't know.
I know you don't. I'm just pointing out the parallels that we've been examining all morning with America. The other question we've been asking all morning, and I'd be interested in your answer to this. You don't have to answer because I'm ambushing you with it.
Sure.
Is it deliberate? I mean, not necessarily...
Oh, without any shadow of a doubt.
Go on.
Oh, absolutely. Unequivocally, it's deliberate. And I will say on your radio show this morning that he is inciting hatred to MPs.
And that is why the memory of Joe Cox is invoked.
Absolutely.
To remind all of us that sometimes it's not just words.
People accusing me of using Joe's memory couldn't be further from the truth, James. But as you're aware, I represent the constituency next door to where Joe was. So we felt it acutely. Still do, every single day. And, I would never use Joe. Ever. Indeed, when Joe died, I didn't do any media interviews for weeks because I was absolutely beside myself. But we have to accept that words have consequences. And that was the point I was trying to make last night.
Well,
if we're not careful, we've seen there was almost an attack on Rosie Cooper. If we're not careful, something else will happen.
Gina Miller's seen one of her abusers jailed. There have been other cases, of course. You have to go to chamber.
I'm afraid so.
No, I'm telling you do. I'm just watching the screen. Paula Sheriff, many thanks indeed, the MP for Dewsbury, who clearly was speaking very much from the heart yesterday. Doesn't mean you have to agree with her, but I'm afraid that if you don't, then something's gone horribly, horribly wrong in your moral makeup. It's just an interesting overview. Still torn, actually, as many of us are, between the professional fascination, even excitement, of these astonishing developments and events, but also as a person, as a father, and a son, and a brother, and a husband, and a hopefully decent human. It's terrifying what we're seeing. Terrifying even on relatively low levels, like Ian Dale on television, having to remind people that the rule of law is quite important, and to malign Supreme Court judges, all 11 of them, are somehow acting out of something other than professionalism and objectivity. Like, that way, absolute madness lies, and yet it's normal now, utterly normalised. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. PMQs, some urgent questions have been submitted to the House. Theo Ushwood is here to talk us through the
fourth urgent question of the day is from Jess Phillips, asking Boris Johnson to make a statement and to reflect on his language and his role as Prime Minister to create a safe environment both in the country and in our Parliament. The Prime Minister and his team have found the most junior minister to answer that question on behalf of the government. The interim Parliamentary Secretary for the Constitution, Kevin Foster, will be providing the answer on behalf of the Prime Minister in the House of Commons in a very short while. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson is introduced. There's a very unusual for the timing meeting of the 1922 Committee of Conservative MPs in Portcullis House as we speak.
Well, I'm glad you've reminded us of that. So, I mean, did we read much into the relative inferiority of the minister that they've put in front of the dispatch box this morning?
You could possibly read something into
Are
that.
you? Or not?
Yes.
Trust me, I genuinely, I don't know.
Yes,
I'm in the dark
absolutely.
on this stuff.
They could find they could find Michael Gove.
So you're suggesting that the seniority of the responder might be an indication of how seriously they're taking the allegations and the questions?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So
well, that's pretty grim,
if there's a big problem for the government and they think that they need to address that problem, then they will put up, the form book is that they put up the most senior minister possible to take that. And often they'll put up the person who has been asked the question. But if that person doesn't want to ask a question, then if they're taking it really seriously, they're going to put somebody up very capable and senior to answer it. I'm not saying Mr. Foster isn't capable. What I'm saying is, as the interim parliamentary secretary for the Constitution, he is very junior. In fact, he's pretty much on the... He is just above the people who carry the bags for the ministers.
What will happen at the 22 then? What's that in aid of, so to speak?
Rally the troops, and there's also...
Now, you just heard Paula Sheriff tell me that the Conservative MPs have been sharing their misgivings and profound disquiet about what Boris, including, she said, one cabinet minister. So there is a job here.
There is a job to do, yes, there is a job to do, quite right. He needs to galvanise his parliamentary party. He's then got a meeting at 5:30, we now understand, of the political cabinet inside Downing Street. We're told that isn't to read into the fact that Boris Johnson is planning to prorogue Parliament for a second time. They are planning for the conference to go ahead, but they have a big problem because later on today there is going to be a vote to put Parliament into recess so that until next Thursday, so the Conservative Party can hold their conference, and it's unlikely that the government is going to win that, and so you're going to have a problem for the Prime Minister, and you're going to have the Conservative Party conference in Manchester at the same time that the House of Commons is sitting, and that would leave the Prime Minister open to ambush.
It is 11:53. Do we know what the other urgent questions will be?
There was one this morning from James Duddridge, he took the question, in fact. He was the junior Minister of the Department for Exiting the European Union, and he said that the government was going to, and this was in response to Ian Murray, he said the government was going to comply with the law. They're looking at a way, that's the Ben Act, which of course requires the Prime Minister to go back to Brussels and seek an extension to Article 50.
And that's still not clear. I mean, what is it practically?
Well, they're looking
October next week.
They're looking at a way around not to comply with the law, but not to fulfil that
October on
demand.
Monday.
Sorry?
It's October on Monday.
Yes, it is October. So they have got until the 19th of October to comply with that.
And what was it Donald Tusk said when he granted the last extension?
Don't waste this time.
Don't waste this time.
So they're looking at a way, and the talk yesterday was that they would submit a first letter requesting extension, then submit a second letter saying ignore the extension. David Allen Green on Twitter was saying that there's something called the Padfield Convention, which means, of course, you can't claim to have obeyed the law on one hand and then completely disobeyed it on the other.
And you would once have thought there's no way Downing Street could have called something so badly, but then you remember the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court and you think, well, actually, that they could easily have called things so badly.
And then there's Catherine West, the Labour MPs, asking Dominic Raab about Hong Kong. That's just happened. And then the SNP's Chris Law is asking Liz Truss about illegal arms sales in Saudi Arabia.
Theo Ashwood, many thanks. Do you think we should do Mystery Hour 5 minutes? Is there going to be much going on between 12 and 1? There could be a public outcry. There could be civil disobedience if we drop Mystery Hour.
Do Mystery Hour.
Are you sure?
I think people need...
A bit of light relief at the moment.
Yeah, people need some light relief.
It actually feels like hard work occasionally, this, at the moment, just keeping everything up and sort of Bristol fashion.
People need light relief, and then if anything earth-shattering happens, then I'll let you know.
Theo Ashwood, many thanks indeed. If you're wondering, perhaps, and again, I until I am given a very good reason not to, I will presume sincerity on the part of critics and the confused. I will presume that you genuinely didn't understand why Paula Sheriff felt moved to cite the memory of her friend Jo Cox, and I will explain. So why is surrender a difficult word, perhaps. Some people are genuinely perhaps confused about that. This is a helpful illustration from Blake. He says, a few weeks ago, I hadn't heard a lot of news because I was working, but I knew that Boris Johnson had started using the word surrender because so many people on Twitter had started saying, we will never surrender. It's also a popular refrain for football hooligans through the ages, in the context of the IRA, believe it or not. No surrender to the IRA will still be chanted on football terraces by people who would probably struggle to spell IRA. But there we are. So surrender is a very inflammatory and provocative word. And the question, if you were listening at 10 o'clock this morning, you'll know from my tone that my question was entirely well-meaning, and I probably lent a little bit towards answering it no myself. Do you think this is deliberate? I'm not in much doubt now. Of course it's deliberate. If you heard Paula Sheriff answer that question herself, of course it's deliberate, because what's the alternative? If we're not talking about the latest outrage, if we're not talking about the latest crisis, we'll be asking very simply, tell us why Brexit is a good idea. And that is the thing they fear the most. Go on, tell us why it's a good idea. Or let's just have a look at some of the stuff you said would happen and work out whether or not it was true when you said it. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. It's 11:56. Nii is in Chester. Nii, what would you like to say?
I would just like to say everything he's doing is actually on purpose, to be honest. And I'm not surprised by anything he does anymore. I can wake up tomorrow and I can, hear like he's actually used the N-word on my CV.
It's a terrible phone line, Nii. I do apologise because you've been on hold while I've been wanging on and talking to Theo and all that sort of malarkey. But we'll try and fix that up. I'll have a quick word with Adam in Watford. What do you reckon, Adam?
Yes, as far as Boris's behaviour yesterday in Parliament, I think there's a much more simple explanation for the way he behaved. It's down to his personality, about the fact that he's actually a narcissist, and he has a narcissistic personality. Anyone who's a child who expressed a desire to be world king might give you an idea of the way that his mind works.
I know, I love my job, and but one of the times I love it the most is when I find myself pushed into defending people that I'm normally attacking. But lots of people might have said silly stuff like, I want to be world king when they were kids. There was a kid in my dorm, Adam, at Amper's. And he wasn't a narcissist or a sociopath. He was just a bit of a geek, but he used to spend hours planning on how he would... It was a sort of early Greta Thunberg, actually. He was going to have a world government that would save the planet.
Well, fair enough, but associate that with all of the rest of his behaviour ever since. Everything is about him.
Yes.
Not about what anything else as far as the country is concerned.
I'll give you that. I don't know if anyone now could argue with that, really, rationally, but of course they don't want to argue with it rationally. They just want to shout slogans from the sidelines, which is why the request for those slogans to be dialed down was greeted with such derision by Boris Johnson, because they're all he's got.
Yeah, again, the reason why I put it in the terms of narcissism is just the traits of narcissism. Everything's about them. They're never wrong. You never feel any shame, and also have a lack of empathy.
Well, I don't think I can pick many holes in those descriptions.
So when anyone else, no one who is a decent human being would react in the way that he reacted in Parliament yesterday. No one who's a decent human being, for example, would have responded to all of the written words and errors it has made by saying it's not his fault.
Do you know?
It's the way it's been interpreted.
Imagine a world in which a Prime Minister is told about death threats being issued to fellow parliamentarians and reminded of one that was followed through on. And he says nothing to condemn the threats.
Yeah.
He reaches immediately to condemn the person telling him the truth.
But there is another little side to it that fits in with the characteristics of being a narcissist, is that you hear reports about the fact that also he wants to be loved. He doesn't like being disliked.
No.
He's sensitive about being disliked. And if you look at all of the characteristics on a diagnostic manual of a narcissist, that is one of them. So you have this peculiar...
desire for adulation. One of his critics said that about him once, in the context of a mayoral election, is that he's not like other politicians. Some of them he veritably revel in being disliked, Didn't Margaret Thatcher say something about being judged by the enemies that you make? make. Johnson does appear, or did used to certainly, appear to be a man who was desperate for approval and adulation, even from people who didn't like him. But that must be taking a toll on his sort of psychic strength at the moment. If he does desperately want to be liked, he's adopted a path that is deliberately designed to ensure that he gets cheered by people who he's conned and condemned for the rest of eternity by people who've seen through him. It's 12 noon. Thank you for that, Adam. And if you are eagle-eared, what's the equivalent of having eagle eyes in an auditory sense? Eagle-eared is obviously meaningless. What would it be? Owl? Ears like an owl? Anyway, you'll have noticed that there was no Mystery Hour jingle at the top of the hour, which is a fairly reliable indicator that this week there is no Mystery Hour. There's too much going on in the world of politics. My apologies if you feel that is the wrong decision, but it is one by which I am prepared to stand. 4 minutes after 12 is the time, and of course events in the House of Commons demand our attention as well. If you had to make a prediction on what Boris Johnson will do next, the playbook suggests victimhood next. Poor me, poor me. Why are they being so mean to me? I presume that's a sort of 60% prediction, coupled with a side order of I know you are, but what am I? So you'll see a lot of that out there already today. This idea that the kind of division and disgraceful language and behaviour that Boris Johnson stands accused of is somehow the fault of the people describing it. That you're just as bad as he is, they will say. Which is, of course, why Donald Trump was a little bit ahead of the curve for once when he talked about there being decent people, or what was the phrase he used? Very fine people on both sides, when neo-Nazis and anti-Nazis to sort of simplify things for ease of consumption, were both on the streets of Charlottesville. So that's my little friendly prediction. Keep it in your pocket. Don't sue me if I'm wrong. He'll start complaining about how everyone's being mean to him, and he'll rely upon his supporters to accuse his critics of doing the things that he has done himself. But her emails, perhaps, the equivalent of. 6 minutes after 12 is the time. I'll take a few more calls from people who've been waiting for an unconscionably long time, but also find ways of rejigging proceedings slightly so that we can examine some of the events that are unfolding. I know that Jess Phillips has been on her feet in the House of Commons, so we'll catch up with that in a moment. First, though, back to Chester, where Niyi has hopefully improved his line. Where were we?
Hi, good morning. Sorry about that.
That's not your fault. Carry on.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm not surprised anymore by anything Boris Johnson does or say at the moment now, because it's kind of who he is, and anyone that's still surprised is probably a bit naive then.
When did he... Well, I'm still surprised. You must have been surprised when he said humbug after being told by someone who was clearly in a highly distressed state about what she was witnessing, and he just said humbug. Even I'd sort of dropped my tea, metaphorically speaking, at that point. No?
No, to be honest, because our politics is a bit more like a cult at the moment, to be honest.
Yes.
Because everyone seems to find a way to defend whatever disgusting thing someone else thinks.
It's a very good point. I mean, in the context of the two major parties, of course, you had people defending Jeremy Corbyn for liking a profoundly anti-Semitic Facebook post and claiming that he hadn't seen it when he liked it or something like that. So people of all extremities will bend themselves backwards in order to pretend, I guess, or to cling on to the illusion that the cult leader is deserving of their adoration.
Yeah, and it's not just wanting to be seen as being, like, bigoted, like yourself in a way. Because some people just... Because I have a few, tears in my family.
Yes.
And I keep asking them, okay, he's lied about this, he's lied about that, he's lied. Okay, would that be okay if my niece or my nephew said something like that?
Yes.
And they just keep finding different excuses.
But you see, by pointing out his lies, you are doing what he's done. You're adding to the division. This will be the next stage of the defence. And I don't know how you respond to that. You said, well, could you think of another word to describe somebody who has said something that is categorically not true?
I don't know. I wish there was another way.
But that's what they're trying. That is the next stage of the false equivalence debacle, isn't it? Is that language like traitor, betrayal, surrender? Not just Johnson, of course. I genuinely don't remember him using the specific word traitor, but he's used the rest of them, and that is somehow going to be held up as the same as calling a liar a liar.
Yeah, I know. The funniest one was actually when the Piccaninny comment. I brought it up because I'm black, and I actually brought it up to my brother-in-law, and he seems to find an excuse. That was probably taken out of context.
Yeah, that is it. And context is important. That I think it was a Spectator article in which he talked about smiling piccaninnies with watermelon smiles, and there's an argument that it was a sort of throwback to 1950s style depictions, and similarly describing women in face veils as being like bank robbers and letterboxes is sort of defensible, I suppose, in the sense that people sought to defend it, but context is crucial, and you can just about see how people might have persuaded themselves that wasn't as unpleasant as many of us thought, and that's their right. That's what freedom of speech, freedom of expression involves. But to start essentially saying stop calling a liar because you're adding to the febrile atmosphere, that's not the answer. Let's cross now to the Commons. John Bercow has just granted an urgent question due, he says, to the appalling atmosphere in the chamber yesterday.
Order. I referred earlier to events in the chamber yesterday. What I'm about to say, I say as much for the benefit of people observing our proceedings as for members of the House. I think it is extremely important that our proceedings are accessible to the people who are interested in them. In light of the appalling atmosphere in the chamber yesterday and the toxicity which it can spawn or exacerbate in the country at large, I have granted an urgent question to the Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley, which treats of this matter. In my book, it is manifestly urgent. Urgent question, Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had wanted to ask the Prime Minister, but I shall ask the Minister if he could ask the Prime Minister to reflect on his language and his role as Prime Minister to create a safe environment both in our country and in our country's Parliament.
Thank you. Minister Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British democracy has always been robust and vibrant. Healthy, respectful debate is vital to our democracy. Freedom of speech is a fundamental British liberty, but it is not an excuse to threaten or abuse anyone whose views you do not agree with. That liberty is compromised when a culture of intimidation forces people out of public life or discourages citizens from engaging in the political process. Let me make clear and say with no equivocation, such behaviour is wrong, unacceptable and must be addressed.
12 minutes after 12 is the time. That just a few moments ago in the Commons. The Minister is still on his feet. I suspect Jess Phillips isn't entirely satisfied with that answer. He was clearly profoundly unsatisfied with the absence of the Prime Minister. 12 minutes after 12 is the time. I'll take a few more of your calls. The question of whether or not it's deliberate is looking close to rhetorical this afternoon, even. At 10 o'clock, it felt like a brilliant question to ask. I still think it was at 10 o'clock, but that's the nature of changing face of British politics at the moment. By 12 minutes past 12, everyone seems to agree it is deliberate. And, of course, you have the people who love it in the same way that, you know, we had that Daily Mail columnist talking about how Boris Johnson was obviously lying about the prorogation of Parliament, and he employed the McDonald's advertising slogan to describe his own reaction to the Prime Minister lying to the British people and the British Parliament. And the phrase is, of course, I'm loving it. So there are clearly people loving it. They love being lied to. Just don't ask them too many questions about that, because obviously the absurdity of their own position would become completely clear, and I'd rather you wait till they rang me. And then on the other side, you've got people who think it's deliberate and can't quite believe that Britain has been brought so low by the aftermath and the ripples still emanating from that ludicrous referendum in 2016. It is 12:13. It's odd that we've spent 2 hours talking about this, and then the headline on the BBC at the moment is claims PM is using inflammatory language as a tactic. I think he probably is. I really do. And almost all of my callers today have agreed. Nick's in Wimborne. Nick, are you going to swim against the tide of consensus?
Hello, James.
Hello.
I've got a bit of a cold, so bear with me. No. What I was going to say is deliberate, yes, but also it has a purpose, a clear purpose. And the purpose, obviously, is to whip up those that voted Leave and to frighten those that voted Remain, to put us into the right kind of shape to sort of play us both off, if you like, because when May's deal is brought back and put on the table, I believe it'll be pushed through because Remain MPs will be, oh my God, we've just got to get Brexit over the line and get it done.
Yes.
And to me,
I think you might well be right.
That is the greatest fear, because unfortunately I see May's deal as no deal. I always have done, because it doesn't define the deal for the future. And
but
so
no, it's a withdrawal agreement, though, rather than the deal for the future. The withdrawal agreement is a prerequisite for the negotiation of the deal for the future. So I don't quite follow you there.
Well, it is indeed, but it basically gives a transition period for 2 years where nothing will change. So everybody will say, look, project's here again. We've left the EU, but nothing changed, so all is fine. But at the end of the 2 years, the ERG get their way if they wish, because we can just drop off the planet with a no deal. For the future, you know, the withdrawal document just deals with just paying off our debts and dealing with our citizens and dealing with Northern Ireland, creating stability there for just a 2 year period, unless we get an extension from that. So if people think that Brexit's going away as a result of pushing May's deal through, you know, it's just not going to happen. This is just the start, I'm afraid.
I do know. I haven't heard it from that end before. I've heard plenty of ERG sympathisers expressing misgivings about the withdrawal agreement. Of course we have. They all voted against it at least once. Some of them, of course, voted both for and against it at the second or third time of asking. But that idea that we'd be rule takers, not rule makers, fits their narrative. You're a Remainer, am I right?
Oh, very much so, yes.
Yes, well, you say very much so. It wasn't immediately obvious, actually. I am also a Remainer. I don't know whether you've picked up on that over the last few days or weeks, but right now, if I was an MP, I think I'd probably vote for the withdrawal agreement because we've seen the whites of their eyes, Nick, and they are quite mad.
Yes,
and they've got
indeed.
their hands on the steering wheel. So if the choice is, do we steer into that sandbank over there, which is far from desirable and obviously inferior to staying on the road we're currently on, or do we leave these clowns in the driving seat when they are swearing blind that they're quite prepared to drive into a brick wall because, fish? I'd go into the lay-by. I'd vote for the withdrawal agreement. So I think your analysis is correct, but I'm not spooked by it in the way that you are. Jeremy Corbyn is on his feet in the House of Commons.
Years ago, our colleague, our member, Joe Cox, was murdered by a far-right activist shouting, "Britain first, this is for Britain." The language that politicians use matters and have real consequences. To dismiss concerns from members about the death threats they receive and to dismiss concerns that the language used by the Prime Minister is being repeated in those death threats is reprehensible. To dismiss those concerns in an abusive way, as he did, is completely unacceptable. And I pay tribute to my honourable friends for Dewsbury and for Batley and Spen and other members, including the member for Broxtowe, for what they said yesterday. Today, I've written to all members of the Parliamentary Labour Party expressing my solidarity to my friends and set out the conduct expected of all colleagues. No side of this House, as you've said, Mr. Speaker, has a monopoly of virtue. Inappropriate language has been used by all sides. But we all have a duty to keep our debates political and not to descend into personal abuse. I disagreed profoundly with the previous Prime Minister, but she did offer cross-party talks to try to find a compromise. She also set out her approach to this House, allowing for scrutiny and debate. I was also pleased to participate in a meeting with the former Prime Minister and other party leaders about conduct and abuse in the House and around the parliamentary estate. The current Prime Minister, unfortunately, has sought to entrench divisions. refused to set out any detail of the deal he is seeking, and continues to pledge that they will leave with no deal on the 31st of October, despite the fact that this House has voted against and legislated against an outcome. Not only should the Prime Minister comply with the law, he should come to this House and apologise for his conduct yesterday, which fell well below the standards expected by the people of this country of the way their elected representatives should behave, should speak, and should treat each other.
Minister Foster. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's clear that, having already outlined what the government is doing, but of course our Leader of the Opposition mentions the murder of Joe Cox, a dreadful crime committed by an extremist. And many of us who were in the House at that time remember exactly where we were when we heard the news of that appalling attack, in my case attending a constituency event, in the same way that many from a previous generation of politics remember where they were when they heard that our colleagues Anthony Berry or Robert Buckland or Airey Neave had been assassinated by those looking to bring terror to this country. So what I would say is that actually the biggest issue is that delay will just bring more division to this country. And in terms of having Bradford, I apologise, Robert Bradford, thank you for correcting me, Mr. Speaker. In terms of looking to how we are tackling this as a government, we do need to bring a resolution to debates. And as the Leader of the Opposition will know, the government has been clear that we're prepared to take our arguments to the country on Tuesday the 15th of October and ask the electorate to pass a judgment. And that would have given a chance to not only resolve the division affecting this House, but also to give a way for the country to move forward. Because as you yourself have reflected, Mr. Speaker, the passions that this issue has inflamed will only carry on if there is not a resolution.
That was Kevin Foster, the Parliamentary Secretary in the Cabinet Office, deputising for the Prime Minister. And I think, unless I missed something, and I may have done, completely failing to answer Jeremy Corbyn's call for the Prime Minister simply to apologise for what he did last night.
Argument to the wider issues of MP's safety. But what this question is about is what happened here yesterday. It was completely unacceptable behaviour in every way. Whipping up a crowd, creating division is not helpful from whichever side it comes. If we cannot do this in this place, Mr. Speaker, maybe it is time to put aside our party parliamentary T-shirts, our Brexit Remain T-shirts, and put on a T-shirt that stands for parliamentary democracy. Unity of purpose, consensus and agreement. Yesterday was unacceptable, and if we don't do something to change this, we are putting our parliamentary democracy at threat.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the question, it clearly relates to creating a safe environment both in the country and in Parliament. And certainly, as the Minister responsible, I don't want to see this about being a debate about MPs just being a case on our own. There are many who face abuse and intimidation for being part of this, from the judiciary to journalists and to those who will never be members of Parliament but who just want to take part in our democratic process. But as is touched on, we heard the comments you gave this morning, Mr. Speaker, about some of the thoughts and reflections on what may happen in this place, and ultimately it is for the House itself to decide how it wishes to regulate itself, how it wishes to behave, what changes it may wish to make to its own standing orders, and of course we can rely on yourself, Mr. Speaker, and whoever's elected to replace you to lead the way in enforcing them.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, as others have said, the scenes in the House of Commons last night were deeply disturbing. The Prime Minister's tone was appalling, his behaviour was appalling, and his language was appalling. We've got in number 10 a man who has built his career on making inflammatory remarks, stoking division and shouting down those who disagree with him. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is not fit for office. His behaviour is an outrage, and his government is treating people disgracefully. People want leadership, Mr. Speaker, and they want accountability. What should have happened yesterday is that the Prime Minister should have come in front of this House and apologised for acting unlawfully. He should have held his hands up, agreed he'd acted wrongly, and pledged not to do it again. Instead, he chose to brazen it out, proving that he embodies the very worst of the wrongs in our society and totally ignoring the 7 principles of public life. Mr. Speaker, young people are watching our Parliament today. They're watching and learning that in order to get to the top, all you need to do is break the law and shout people down. The House of Commons and the Prime Minister should be setting a good example to all of those living across these aisles. The Prime Minister should be here today. The Prime Minister should pledge to stop using language that incites hatred or violence, whether that's against other MPs, citizens with different political beliefs, or migrants who've chosen to come and live and work in the UK. Will the Minister ask the Prime Minister to come before us and do that? Here.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say, it's when we look at how we reflect on creating a safe environment for debate, I'm sure many colleagues will be reflecting on exactly how that was shown in the Times online in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. But I think what I would say is, hearing the comments that have just been made, if the Scottish National Party has no confidence in the Prime Minister, then there was a perfect opportunity offered yesterday for them to table a motion for debate to that effect today. There was also an opportunity for them to take their arguments to the country on Tuesday, the 15th of October. However, it's an invitation they declined.
It's a disgraceful thing to do. Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Speaker, there is already a danger in these exchanges of it turning into a holier-than-thou competition. And I think we should reflect on how much unhappiness and anxiety there is amongst members of the House, and that this is going to be expressed in various ways. And people are going to use robust and emotive language in order to express their views, and that is entirely understandable. May I just make one request, Mr. Speaker, that we no longer invoke the name of any person who has been a victim of attacks in order to try and make political points. Because, well, there we are.
Oh, for shame. This is Bernard Jenkins digging.
To shame other members of this House. I don't personally think any of the exchanges and mentions of Jo Cox yesterday was particularly fair on her family.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's always useful to benefit from the experience of the right honourable member in this House over many years. And he's right to say that we can have robust, we can have emotive debates. The issues settled in this Parliament are matters of great concern across the nation, and rightly people will get passionate about that. But in doing so, we should not do so with disrespect. And I know, of course, if that had happened, that would be dealt with.
Winston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just gently say to the honourable gentleman opposite that I don't think it is for any member of this House to determine whether another member can talk about their own grief and how they feel in a certain circumstance, and whether that should somehow not be allowed. The language that leaders use matters because it sets the tone for public debate. And I'm sure I'm not alone in looking across the Atlantic at the rallies of crowds of people chanting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton or "send her back" about Ilhan Omar. And by the way, it is no coincidence that it is women that are often the targets of this hate, and especially women of colour. And see worrying echoes in our own politics of that Trumpian approach. And so I ask the Minister whether he can give any assurance that there will be no deliberate campaign to use that kind of language to inflame. But I fear he cannot, because the repeated use of those inflammatory words by the Prime Minister yesterday was, it seemed, very obviously deliberate. And I would just end by saying, Mr. Speaker, that on Tuesday morning I spoke to a group of 400 young women. They asked me how I dealt with abuse and hate on social media as a woman in public life. They asked me whether they thought going into politics was something I would recommend. I want to be able to say to young women like that and to all young people that they should play their role in public life. And we need to be able to, those of us in this House, create the environment that enables those young people to come forward into our public life, and I fear that we are failing to do so.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we all want to see an environment where everyone feels they can take part. That's why I've already outlined some what the government's looking to do around legislating, around intimidation, around election times. And she gives...
And we draw away there from events in the House of Commons where the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, remains notable chiefly by his absence. And the Conservative MP, Bernard Jenkin, suggested that murdered MPs should not be mentioned in the House in the context of threats and dangers that MPs face. 3 sentences later, he mentioned Joe Cox. Make of that what you will, but as I've said to you quite a few times in recent weeks, every time you think things can't get any worse, in Brexit Britain, along comes reality. 12:30 is the time. I think we both called it wrong. I was minded to do Mystery Hour. Theo Osherwood encouraged me to do Mystery Hour, but events in the House of Commons, albeit that I might quite like to look away now, are irresistible. Here is Ken Clarke on his feet.
On this People versus Parliament platform that Nigel Farage invented and which we're now being imitating. Can my honourable friend assure me that what happened yesterday was one of these occasions when people lost control of themselves and the House, not for the first time, erupted in disorder, and this isn't part of some grand discrediting of the usual political institutions in order to fight a populist and nationalist campaign?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a junior minister, it's always welcome to benefit from the advice of the Father of the House. What I would reassure him is that the strategy the government has is to do what the vast majority of the nation wants to see, which is to bring a resolution to Brexit and deliver the referendum result. And I noticed, even given his own views, the Father of the House has voted for deals and seeing that as compromising and moving forward. And where the government will look to fight a general election is a platform of resolving Brexit, no more delay, pointlessly, for bringing 20,000 extra police officers onto our street, increasing school funding and taking our economy forward. And I have to say our platform will be far stronger than one opposite.
Having called the Father of the House, I want now to call the Mother of the House, Harriet Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for bringing this urgent question, and to you for your comments last night and for your comments from the chair this morning. I agree with the Father of the House in everything that he said, and I think that what happened last night was just an ugly spectacle of things getting even worse that have been happening for months and months. And we all know that honourable members on all sides of the House have felt inhibited in doing their work that they are elected to this place to do. It is important, it's essential, that everybody who's elected to this House is able to speak out without fear or favour to say what they believe in. And nobody in this House should do anything that stops any other member exercising that right. And whether it's threats to people who are Remainers or whether it's people in balaclavas bursting into a university meeting which was being addressed by the Leader of the House, we cannot allow that in our democracy. Nor can we have a situation where members are fearful not only for themselves and their own safety, but their staff and also their families. Now, the government minister has mentioned a number of initiatives, and heaven knows we've had enough discussion and wringing our hands about these problems over the months in this chamber. We have had a number of initiatives, but there is a lack of coherence and focus for action. And that's why the Father of the House and myself have proposed that there should be a Speakers' Conference that brings together the police, the CPS, the House authorities, the parties, and looks at what can be done to ensure that we protect our democracy. And it also needs to look at our political culture. We know, for example, that we cannot call each other blackguard or gutter snipe or stool pigeon or various other things. We need to have rules of this House that are updated and protect us to enable us to do our business today.
Yay. Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can reflect the productive conversation and meeting I had when Mother of the House was present with the Women's Caucus. When again, people should be able to speak out. I think the example given there of one female candidate been advised that the solution to the problem was to not be on campaign on social media was a completely unacceptable solution that had been advised by a local council, thinking that was the way, was that women couldn't engage in politics in the same way as men, which was a completely unacceptable suggestion. But I do think she refers to some of the rules of this House. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, that would be something that you may wish to reflect on, or whoever happens to be elected by this House to replace you may wish to work on, as well as some of the expressions used are ones that probably aren't in common parlance today and compared to other statements that are. But certainly for the government, our focus is that this isn't just about members of Parliament, this is about all who engage in public life, journalists who face abuse for what they say, and others who just want to either to discharge a public duty or to share their opinion in our democracy, and we need to make sure they're covered by any proposals as well.
Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, like many people in this chamber, I was shocked by
12:36 is the time. Remarkable scenes unfolding in Parliament. Sworn political enemies for decades, Harriet Harman and Ken Clarke, both effectively condemning the current Prime Minister's language and tone from last night, and broader tides as well, lapping up upon the shores of our democracy. I need to double-check what Bernard Jenkins actually said, but from where I was sitting, he appeared, and because we're listening to it live, I can't rewind, I sort of pressed a double-take button, appeared to be suggesting that when you're talking about death threats that you've received as a parliamentarian, you shouldn't point out that sometimes these death threats reach a terrible fruition. No, I've said it before. I'm not going to say it again. Luckily, Theo Usherwood is here to spare me from
He was saying, wasn't he, that people shouldn't mention Joe Cox or anybody else who'd been attacked.
Yeah.
So he was trying to place the blame for what the Prime Minister said to Paula Sherriff and to Tracy Brabin, not on the Prime Minister, but on Paula Sherriff and Tracy Brabin. That's what he was trying to do. And we find ourselves now in a place where...
I expect that from someone on Twitter with a pit bull dog as their avatar. I don't really expect it from someone who's been in the House of Commons for 20-odd years.
Well, Bernard Jenkins also said last night when he was interviewed, not just to think about the women who've been attacked in Parliament, female MPs who've been attacked in Parliament, but also to think about what the Prime Minister's had to put up with.
Really?
Yeah, really. Said that on Newsnight last night.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I did suggest moments ago that the next narrative chapter would involve victimhood and poor me, why are they all being so mean to me. I didn't realise Bernard Jenkins had already laid down the groundwork for that. But he could be a rogue trooper. He might be operating alone in that process. I could still be wrong that Johnson will play the victim card next.
You could be wrong, but then it's worth surmising that when the Supreme Court verdict came out, discipline was pretty well enforced in terms of it's very difficult to get Conservative MPs to talk about it. And so Bernard Jenkins could well be seen as somebody who is dispatched to so that lay the groundwork, as you put it. That's probably the best phrase. And of course, Boris Johnson isn't in the chamber. Jeremy Corbyn made the point of turning up in the House of Commons to make his point. The Prime Minister should have been there to have answered questions. Meanwhile...
And do we have a proper explanation of why he isn't? Bernard Jenkins would probably say he's really struggling, he's tired, he needs to lie down. But is there an official explanation for why the Prime Minister isn't there to answer questions directed very, very, very specifically at him?
Well, we asked the Prime Minister's spokesman about that today and why he wasn't there and whether he treated it seriously. And he said that the Prime Minister said that any belief that any attacks on MPs or anybody from any walk of life were completely unacceptable and shouldn't be tolerated. The point that he reiterated was that the Prime Minister is not. He didn't say that the Prime Minister apologised for what happened. There was no apology from his spokesman. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is making it political, going to the 1922 committee at the same time and telling the Conservative MPs that Labour were trying to make the use of the word surrender and surrender bill a political issue, and that the Conservatives mustn't be knocked off from using that word. And this is reminiscent of the £350 million on the back of on the side of the bus that Dominic Cummings, who was running the Leave campaign, said could be spent on the NHS if it wasn't sent to Brussels. And the point about surrender and these words is that it's cutting through because everybody's talking about it. People are disagreeing with it. People are saying, well, actually, the Prime Minister's got a point. But the point I'm making is that what Number 10 is trying to do is to get people talking about it, to get the cut through into the British consciousness of the idea that opposition MPs, Labour MPs, are preventing Brexit from happening, that Jeremy Corbyn, as Boris Johnson said in the House of Commons yesterday, is being held captive, or wants the country to be held captive by the European Union. And that's what he's trying to drill down.
The language of war. Ed Miliband has just made this point himself in the House of Commons as you were speaking. He says it's the language suggests we are at war. He's trying to divide an already divided country. The only mystery now is whether or not there's a sort of desperate attempt to... It's like a bloke outside a pub trying to pick a fight with a car. You know, or is this part of a master plan? Because Plan A failed. Plan A was to somehow get to the country in time to be the man that would deliver Brexit, even if it was a no-deal Brexit. I don't know about you, Theo Ushwood, but I don't think he particularly cared whether there was a deal or not. I think he wanted a 5-year pass, which he'd win by an election, doubling down on the Brexit persuading people that somehow yada, yada, boom, boom. That failed. Now they're just making it up as they go along?
I did ask the Prime Minister whether they had a plan. He said that was too much of an open question. The Prime Minister's insisting that they are trying to get a deal with the European Union. They're saying, on the one hand, that the Ben Act, the Surrender Act, as they call it, is preventing the Prime Minister from getting as good a deal as he might otherwise be able to, but the people are working very hard in those negotiations and continue to work very hard with the European Union in those negotiations. But what the Prime Minister and the Conservatives need to tack to, and this is what they will tack to, is once that extension happens, that they would be the ones who were prevented from delivering Brexit. There is the anger there, and this is... Do you remember that video with...
I presume it was a shrinking constituency, but I guess the mathematics, the arithmetic of a general election, very different from the arithmetic of a referendum, which is why they're desperate for a general election to settle Brexit, but simultaneously adamant that we can't have a referendum to settle Brexit, even though Brexit is only happening because of a referendum.
Do you remember that? And of course I should point out at this point that Boris Johnson has denied being in regular contact with Steve Bannon, but do you remember that video that came out... Steve Bannon.
Yes. So I misheard you. I thought you were talking about Brexit hard man, Steve Baker.
No, Steve Bannon. Yeah. And there was that video that came out where he looked at the Telegraph and he said, "This is the tee up."
Yes.
This is the tee up. This is the strategy, is to tee it up, and this is what happened yesterday. This is the tee up, and then.
God, you're right, aren't you?
And then what happens is you have this moment of anger, and then Boris Johnson needs to be able to pivot. Once that extension has been requested.
There is no enemy, so they invent an enemy. That's how Brexit worked. The EU was the enemy. Now, that's not really working, because the EU clearly kind of can't successfully be... So you have to start portraying your colleagues in the House of Commons and even in your own party as the enemy, which we can only vanquish if you vote for me. Just don't ask too many questions about why they're the enemy.
And then the point is that if that extension goes through, there's the pivot to saying you're the ones who stop it, you're the enemy. And then if you vote for me, I'm going to deliver Brexit on January the 31st.
Yes.
The promise, do or die, that's what he needs, that's the hurdle he needs to jump.
But we still don't know. There seems to be... the only theory I can think of as to how they might keep the promise is if they have privately secured pledge from one of the EU 27 that they will veto the request for an extension. Otherwise, that's the only, at the moment, that's all that falls out of the bottom when I sort of shake things up like a Kaplunk chamber. All that falls, because how can they be simultaneously claiming X, Y and Z, Geoffrey Cox saying this, Boris Johnson saying that? They will do everything. They will send the letter. The nonsense about a second letter, I think, has already been shot down. So how could they...
Boris Johnson won't send a letter.
He won't send the letter.
So it'll have to be a civil servant. It has to be the law assumption argument that the senior civil servant sends a letter, and they will push that, I would imagine, all the way to the Supreme... They will push that all the way to the Supreme Court.
And that would involve simply following the law as laid down in our sovereign parliament. That's what the Ben Act compels the Prime Minister to do. And again, we're back to this utterly uncrackable nut that Brexit is all about Parliament not having enough power. But Brexiters are now complaining almost daily in an increasingly childish fashion that Parliament has too much power and had too much power all along, even while they were arguing furiously that it had surrendered power to Brussels.
But the calculation inside number 10 is that when you take this anger and you put it in front of, and you have an election, that Boris Johnson, if there's a way of dealing with Nigel Farage, and of course that is a problem for the Conservatives at the moment, but Boris Johnson can win such a majority that Parliament becomes obsolete, because he commands a majority of 100 in the House of Commons, or even north of 50 in the House of Commons, and he can do what he wants. The European Union's calculation is that if there's a general election in these circumstances, that actually we'll end up again with a hung Parliament and no closer to a solution.
12:45 is the time. Even more grateful than usual to have Theo Usherwood's expertise in the studio with us today. It's odd, actually, while we're discussing toxic communications in the context of what happened in the House of Commons last night. Quick word to the wise. If you're going to send abusive and libelous texts to me, don't do it from a mobile phone number that's linked to your corporate catering company, because it's really, really easy to find you, mate. All right? And next time I might read out a few more details about who you are and what you do, and maybe some of your clients will be astonished to hear your feelings about Donald Trump, particularly perhaps the, "God, you're lucky I'm better than you." 12:50 is the time. I don't know if he'll thank me for pointing this out, but the England football team were a few months away from winning the World Cup when Michael Heseltine entered the House of Commons. He, of course, stayed there for the best part of 4 decades, about 35 years, culminating in a stint as Deputy Prime Minister. He is, as far as I'm aware, still without the Conservative whip after revealing that he was intending to vote for the Liberal Democrats in the last round of European elections, and he joins me on the line now. Forgive the simplicity of my question, Lord Heseltine, but what is going on?
Well, basically, Parliament is deadlocked because the country is deadlocked. And Parliament is a very sophisticated reflection of public opinion. Public opinion is very divided in every part of the country, every family, every company. Everybody knows this, and Parliament reflects that. I'm afraid yesterday the Prime Minister's performance fell a great deal further than I would have ever expected a British Prime Minister to commit in the House of Commons. And what it really shows is that this government, since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, is conducting an election campaign. From day one, the whole issue of Brexit, which is the cancer at the core of our dilemma, has been muddled up with photo opportunities with the police and the troops and big promises about the NHS. In other words, all the sort of populist promises in order to try and make sure that when an election comes, Brexit slides through without the proper scrutiny it deserves. And this is highly controversial. People have very strong feelings on both sides. And this is very dangerous. As many members of Parliament pointed out yesterday, there are people who get tipped over by this language. Once you start talking about traitors and surrenders and all that, you're into a sort of a climate where a very small number of people, let's be frank, a very small number of people lose control and do terrible things. I think it was appalling the way in which the memory of Joe Cox became part of a sort of political football in the House of Commons. a very hard-working, decent lady who served her country to the best of her abilities and paid a terrible price for it. And that should not in any way ever be part of the dialogue of the House of Commons in the circumstances and in the language in which it was used.
Are you criticising Paula Sherriff for citing her memory in the first place?
Am I sorry, what?
Are you criticising the MP Paula Sherriff for citing Joe Cox's memory in the first place, Lord Heseltine, just to be clear?
No, I don't think. I think it's legitimate to ask about the memory in measured tones, but to turn it into a political argument about how to resolve Brexit is, I think, trespassing on people's goodwill.
What happens next?
Well, you know, I've now been talking on your programme and many programmes, and the dilemma we have, and every commentator that I talk to who interviews me agrees with it, is that none of us have got the first idea. So we're always being asked what next, and nobody knows. And indeed, if we had forecast the sort of things that have happened, people would have thought we'd lost our senses. Yes. If I had said that a Conservative government would prorogue Parliament illegally, you would have shaken your head and said, well, the poor old boy's lost his marbles.
Never. I'd never be so undiplomatic, but I might have chosen different language.
You might have thought it. Anyway, there it happened, and you would have thought that the Prime Minister would have been contrite and at least apologetic and explained in measured language how the process had come about. Far from it. We got a rant. I mean, it was just from the moment he started, it was an election campaigning rant. And so tempers are very fraught. Now, my own view is that a general election can't be long delayed because the government has no majority. There's no way it can get a majority to govern the country, to make the changes that are necessary. But, of course, what Parliament is very frightened of is this juxtaposition of the Brexit cancer with the agenda of governing the country. And they want the two separate so that the people can make a very clear view.
There's plenty of people on the Conservative benches who presumably are pretending not to understand that. All of the talks of cowardice and calling for an election, but they only really float if you pretend that you haven't heard the repeated explanation that they won't consent to an election or seek an election until the no deal or no idea Brexit has been categorically ruled out.
Well, you have to, you know, and I know this and I was part of it, you have to understand the tribal loyalties of the Commons. The vast majority of members of Parliament are going to support their leader, support their party through thick and thin. That is the real world. I mean, if I may make a point, if a Labour government had behaved in the way this government has behaved, then the demand for resignation of the Prime Minister would have been hung high on Big Ben.
Yes.
But of course, it's a Conservative Prime Minister, and therefore the old loyalties are brought into play. But anyway, my own view, and it's not altogether a popular one, although it's got quite a lot of support, is that the only way to resolve the Brexit issue is to separate it off from the political agenda and have another referendum, which, of course, would be difficult. I understand all the arguments, but it's the only way I can see to address the specific issue. Otherwise, what I see happening is eventually we'll have an election, and my guess is, on looking at all the polls, is that won't change anything, and we'll just get another hung parliament.
Final question, Lord Heseltine, as we're in the realms of your views. Is this a deliberate tactic on the part of Boris Johnson?
Oh, yes, quite deliberate. From the moment he became Prime Minister, he was electioneering. And
but to foment the division and to double down on
yes, but he has to do that because his real fear is the hemorrhaging to the right of the Conservative Party to Brexit. So he knows to win an election he has got to defuse the Brexit Party. There are two ways to do it. One is to actually have a deal, so that he can say, I did it, but that's a pretty difficult order for him to pull off. So he's got to out-Brexit Nigel Farage. Now, you start trying to out-Nigel Farage, and you are stretching elastic to breaking point.
There is a third option. He could start telling the truth about Brexit.
But that would be difficult because that would undermine the case for Brexit at one fell swoop, as did the Yellowhammer documents.
Well,
I mean, anyone who is conversant with what's happening to the British economy, I mean, the devastation of the devaluation, the number of people moving jobs to the continent, the motive industry in one of the most difficult positions it's been in years. I mean, the Brexit case is the more you know about it, the more frightened you are about it.
Which is perhaps why the Prime Minister is so keen for us to be talking about other things. Lord Hasseltine, thank you for your help this afternoon in avoiding that trap. It is coming up to 12:59. That is it from me for another day.